Hello, I'm Sarah from Sew and today I'm going to show you how to sew a set-in sleeve using a French seam. I know it sounds kind of daunting and impossible, but it's actually really easy to do it, I promise. It's almost easier than doing it the regular way, not with a French seam, and you'll probably be surprised how easy it is. Alright, so what I have here is a front and back bodice, just the one side. I've already sewn my shoulder and my side seam. I already have my sleeve here, the underarm sewn, and yes, I do like to set in a sleeve with the underarm sewn and the side seam sewn already before I start setting in the sleeve, rather than doing it where the underarm is open, the side seam is open, and then you set the sleeve onto the armhole, then sew all this up at once. I like it to do it the other way. I feel like the sleeve functions better. It's a more classic way to sew it. It looks nicer on the inside, and I'm a bit traditional when it comes to sleeves. All right, so let's get going. You can see I've already started a little bit here. I find that with French seams, the seam allowance that is most ideal is about 5/8 of an inch. So if you have something smaller, it does get a little tricky, especially on sleeves. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to put in what I like to call an easing stitch. It's not quite a basting stitch because we're not going to sew it to anything, and it's not a gathering stitch because we don't technically want to gather any of this up. We're just going to ease this sleeve right into that armhole. And I will tell you that the amount of ease in this sleeve is about 1.5 inches to the armhole. That's about the maximum that you're going to get. So you're going to see it tested to the fullest. Most set-in sleeves that you buy commercially are probably going to be about 1 inch to 1.25 inches bigger than the armhole, and 1.5 inches is about the max that you're going to see. Anything more than that gets pretty tricky. It's definitely possible, but you'll find that 1.25 inches is about the standard. And the more ease, the better the fit. All right, so let's put that easing stitch in. Actually, don't change the length of my stitch. I just keep it at the regular stitch length. If yours is pretty small, then you might want to add length to your stitches between the notches. And I just stitch between the front and the back notch. That's it. I'm going to stitch just inside the seam line, the actual seam line. So we're going to say it's 5/8. And I'm going to stitch just inside, all the way around between those two notches, or the front notches and the back notches. All right, I like to pull the threads on the bobbin side, and that's because I like to actually remove the basting stitch at the very end rather than leaving it in the sleeve. You don't have to remove it, but it is a little nicer. It kind of relaxes the gathers that we're kind of adding in. I know they're not gathers, but we are gathering it up a little bit. And when I do it from the bobbin side, I can find that thread a lot easier than if I do it than if I pull the thread from the outside of the sleeve. All right, so you're gonna pull that bobbin thread, and you're just gonna pull it so that it starts ruffling up, but you're not getting any gathers actually on the seam line. There's no actual bumps or pleating happening there. All the gathering is on either side of this stitch line. And I just go to the crest of the cap, and then I do go to the other side. You just gotta kind of guess about how much you're going to do. I just kind of do it so that it's all ruffled up a little bit, because I can always release it as I'm setting it in. All right, so I probably added a little more than I need. And now you're gonna put your sleeve wrong sides together to the bodice. And so I like to sew from inside the sleeve. I don't think it's very easy to do it any other way. So I put the sleeve inside the bodice, and I'm gonna just check. How did I do guessing on my gathers here? I'm just gonna kind of put this in the armhole, line it up a little bit, and just kind of look at it right now. Just kind of shake it out and see. And it's already fitting in there without me adjusting anything, so we're doing pretty good. All right, so line up your underarm seam. Now, if your fabric is pretty thick with your French seams, if you're doing French seams in your underarm and on your side seam, you may want to offset the seam allowances here. So I like to still keep the bodice pointing towards the back, so I'll just move the sleeve towards the front. It's less noticeable. And I just nest them together nice and tight so that the seam line is still matched up. And now my first pass is going to be 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you can pin your sleeve in there if you like. I'm not going to. That'll give you time to kind of keep up with me. I'm going to press my seam allowance of the shoulder towards the back. And I'm just going to pin my shoulder notch where the cap notch is here on the sleeve, goes to the shoulder seam there. Almost all set-in sleeves will have that notch right there, and it goes to the shoulder seam. Some set-in sleeves I know are a little different, or maybe you're setting in a sleeve to a shirt that has a yoke. You're just going to have to judge where that notch goes. All right, so here we go. So I'm stitching 1/4 inch, and I want all this fullness to be towards the cap, not down here where the notches are. That I want to be pretty flat. You want all this fullness to be up at the top of the sleeve, because that's the fullest part of your arm. That's where the gush of the arm is, and you need this fullness to go around the bicep. All right, so you're going to be stitching through some of this fullness and these little ruffles that we've created, and that's okay. So it may look like you're going to be getting some of those ruffles because you're stitching them down, but I promise it's going to be okay. All right, so keep your bodice nice and flat under there. Keep these raw edges lined up. Maintain that 1/4 inch seam allowance if you're using a 5/8 inch seam. And it's okay if you stitch down these little ruffles and get them to pleat a little bit. I have a little too much fullness in here, I feel like. It's just gonna make mine harder to do, and I think you'll enjoy that better, right? All right, so we're getting this in here. We've got our little pleats. All right, and so now we're at the shoulder. Use my awl a little bit here. So make sure you remember you keep those raw edges lined up. This is honestly the hardest part of doing the entire sleeve with a French seam. So this one can use a few more gathers. So we'll gather it up a little bit more. Remember, I always slide them towards the cap, towards the top of the sleeve where the fullest part of your arm is. And you're just trying to gather it up just right before it starts gathering on that stitch line there. We're just trying to ease it all in there, all that fullness. And this sleeve has a lot of fullness. I think this one might even be maxed at that 1.5 inch, maybe even a little more. This is my own personal sleeve block, and I really like a lot of sleeve ease. All right, so now we're in the home stretch. So you see this gathering thread that I've been pulling on from the bobbin? Tuck that in there. Keep that inside the sleeve. Don't stitch through it. If you do, it's okay. Okay, now we're gonna go to the iron. So you can see, here we go. This is my sleeve seam right here. Now, if I have a little tuck like that, that's okay. See all these little tucks that I stitched down? Where I don't want the tucks is on this easing stitch line that I started with, right? So when we stitched this together, we actually did stitch down all those little gathering edges there. All right, so now we're gonna go to the iron, we're gonna trim this up, and we're gonna press it. Okay? Okay, now we're ready to trim up this edge here. And we're just gonna trim it so that it's nice and flush and we got a nice clean edge. If you're doing a fabric that has a lot of threads, you wanna get rid of as many of those threads as possible so that they don't poke out your finished seam. You want to make this seam allowance nice and even. You're looking at where you stitched in relation to that. Now, even if you stitched or trimmed way too much, it's going to be okay because now our next seam is going to be in relation to this first seam that we just sewed, and it'll all work out math-wise. So if you end up getting a little overzealous in your trimming, that's okay. All right, so we're back at the top. Let's make sure we get this nice and smooth here. Get rid of all those little threads. All right, now we're going to iron. Okay, so we're going to open up this sleeve here. And now you're going to do your best. I know it's a little tricky, but you're going to press this seam one direction. It doesn't matter if you press it this way or towards the sleeve on this first pass. You just want to press it one direction so that the next time we press, it's going to be really easy. It's going to make your French seam so much easier to do if you do this and the next ironing step. Trust me, I've definitely tried to skip this one. Definitely regretted skipping this one. It's worth just trying to do your best here and get most of it pressed toward the sleeve or the bodice. If you have something like a ham or a sleeve board or something like this, you can get in there if you need to. If it's a different kind of garment that might need that. All right, now we're gonna push the sleeve inside. And we're on the wrong side of the garment now. And now we're gonna press along this edge. We're gonna get a nice crisp edge here. Just like this. Go all the way around the cap and the armhole. Now you're not worried about anything yet. We're just gonna press right on this seam edge right here. Sleeves can be kind of finicky as far as how they fit into an armhole and how they fit you. So you want to try and respect the seam allowance on a sleeve and an armhole best you can. All right, so we're almost done. You can see my gathering stitch wasn't that even compared to the seam allowance, but it's all going to be okay. Try and get a nice smooth curve here. All right, do this one a little better. All right, now we have one more stitch left, and you're going to see how wonderful this turns out and how easy it is to do this. Let me get this one a little better here. All right, we're ready. Okay, we have one more step. We're just going to put in our last seam here. I always start down at the side seam underarm area. Gets my sewing legs under me while I approach the cap. And you're going to use the remaining seam allowance that you haven't used. So for me, that's 3/8 of an inch. So if you're using a 5/8 inch seam, your first pass with 1/4 inch, you're left with 3/8. Make sure the bodice underneath stays nice and smooth. I kind of pull the sleeve like this so it stays in this curved way that it wants to sit later. So you just need to kind of smooth it out, and then it will be nice and flat on the underside. Just one way to get it all nice and smooth. All right, so now when you approach that easing stitch, the one we first put in, you're gonna go just to the left of it. And you're going to now start looking to see if you have any tucks or pleats in there, but you probably don't. They're probably all in that seam you already sewn. That's what makes this so much easier than a regular seam. Like I said, always check to make sure your bodice is nice and smooth underneath, or your shirt. This technique can be used in men's and women's clothing. It's the same thing. So now I'm up at the top where the shoulder seam is. And so you can see I kind of pull the garment like this, and I'm kind of curving around it, because that's because it kind of wants to do that. You can feel the tightness of your easing stitch in there as well. So I'm just kind of pushing it against the bodice and making sure that it's going to sit flush. I go just to the left of that basting stitch. I try not to sew over it. Sometimes I do. And that way when I go to remove it, it comes out really easily. I can feel a little tuck in the bodice, so I'm just kind of smoothing it out. This fabric has zero stretch. It's very unforgiving. It's not very flattering. So it is a little trickier to sew, and it's kind of why I like using it. It kind of puts things to the test. All right, we're almost to the end. Just meet up with your first stitch, back stitch, trim your threads. And before we have the satisfaction of removing that basting stitch, let's just take a look at it. Remember, your seam allowance is going to press towards the sleeve, which kind of perks up that cap area. And you can kind of see some of that easing in there, but that's okay. Once we press it, steam it, whatever we're going to do, whatever is appropriate for our fabric, it'll calm down, especially also when we take out that basting stitch. Once it's been worn a few times, ironed, washed, all that, it really does break in and gets nice and smooth. And remember, this sleeve had a lot of ease in it. Yours probably doesn't have quite as much, hopefully. All right, so that looks really good. So let's pull out that basting stitch, and then we're going to do the, we're going to iron that edge, the seam of the cap. So like I said, you don't have to remove your basting stitch, but I do feel like, even though I'm kind of crumpling it all up right now, it does, in the long run, help to relax that gathering that we put in there. All right, so now let's iron it. And you can see there's no tucks in there. It's completely smooth. And I do feel like this is really easy to do because when we stitch down that first pass, we kind of tell the sleeve, hey, this is what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And it has nowhere else to go at that point. Once you've kind of set it down and put it how you're going to have it, the next step is really easy. All right, so give your sleeve a nice press and enjoy. I hope that that makes French seams on set-in sleeves a lot easier for you. Enjoy. Oh, don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe, and any support you can send my way is really appreciated. You can find it in the description. Thanks, bye.